So I want to go now, I've got 3 more questions on indispensable right. One is, this is probably just to be open and honest and unapologetic, probably why I'm not a libertarian is I just don't like stuff like pornography. Like if everybody was Doug, if Doug was all the males in this country, there would be no pornography.
Right.
Okay, you know, who knows? Maybe I don't like people that get away with stuff that I can't come close to getting away with. But, you know, there are some things that just do involve speech that I don't think help society. How do you think about that? You can offend me in any way you want.
No,
but I think the way to go at it is, what if everybody, you know, is a Muslim within the republic or democracy, or everybody is a communist? What, you know, how can culture legitimately, or religion, influence free speech, if at all?
Some people call me a free speech absolutist. I don't think that's true. I do think there are some limits on free speech. But I must admit that my natural default is always with free speech. I am a dinosaur in that sense. I believe that the best way of dealing with bad speech is good speech. But that comes at a price. You have to allow people like Brandenburg to spew his hatred. You have to allow people who engage in pornography. They are consenting adults to be able to exchange that information, as long as it doesn't involve criminal conduct like child pornography. It comes at a cost. But the thing that I warn in the book about is that once you're on the slippery slope, once you start to censor some, you inevitably censor many. That's the story of Europe. They started to censor in a narrow group, and now they have one of the greatest censorship systems ever in the history of the continent. One of the things that I said in Berlin at the World Forum when I was speaking to many in the EU is, when I ask how is it going, the question is really, how's censorship going? The book points out that in the history of humanity, censorship has not worked once. It has a perfect failure rate. It has not silenced a single idea. It has not silenced a single movement. But what it has succeeded in doing over and over again is expand the power of the government. But in terms of what it purports to do, it has failed and will always fail, because free speech has a way of getting out. It's like water. And if I am right and others are right that free speech is a natural right, you can't kill free speech without killing us. So yes, there are areas where you have to accept that people will engage in speech that you find obnoxious and grotesque. Nobody in their right mind would say that Brandenburg is contributing something positive in the hate he was spewing. No one would argue what Brandenburg was spewing in his hatred was beneficial for society. It was a negative cost of free speech. But the value is not to society, but to Brandenburg. The value is to each of us to be able to project part of ourselves in the world around us. For some of us, that image is grotesque, like Brandenburg. For some of it's magnificent, like Michelangelo. But you can't choose, because it is that need to project ourselves that is the essence of free speech. And then we have free speech to be able to counter people like Brandenburg, to defeat bad speech with good speech. I think that we have a far better record of the success of free speech than censorship does, which has a perfect failure rate. But what I would suggest to people is that you can't expect free speech to end racism, sexism, anti-Semitism. Unfortunately, that is also a gene within us. There is part of us that rages against others that are unlike ourselves. That's always going to be part of it. But if you look at the arc of history, free speech has moved us in the right direction. I think there are fewer racists and sexists and anti-Semites tonight. I'd like to believe that. But that is a victory of free speech.
Yeah, and I think the kind of failures that I'm concerned about in, say, not liking pornography are cultural failures more than they are other types. And it just seems that whichever direction you go, even if it's just keeping your protests civil in a university, you have to employ a harm principle. Even the greatest protectors of free speech, like say, Jefferson wouldn't be one of the greatest by any stretch, but if it doesn't break my arm or whatever, it doesn't hurt me. Once you apply the harm principle, it's very difficult to find an overriding principle and how to use it. It's always a slippery slope. So law cannot fix everything. It seems to me, unless you've got ideas that I haven't.
No, and I talk a lot about Mill's harm principle because that is a touchstone of many libertarians, that the proper role of society is to protect from the harm of others, but that one of those harms for Mill was not free speech. And there were some countervailing statements made by Mill, and I certainly talk about that in the book. But what is concerning is that many people, particularly in higher education, have turned the harm principle on its head and argue that free speech itself is harmful and must now be curtailed. That's what much of the book rails against.